Hi, this is Robert Scheer with another edition of Scheer Intelligence, where the intelligence comes from my guests. In this case, two very well known professors of sociology, Charles Derber at Boston College, Yale Magrass, who is the chancellor professor of sociology of University of Massachusetts Dartmouth. Between them, they've written a total of 26 books, I gather, 27, a tremendous output. And what the current book that we're here to discuss is Who Owns Democracy? The Real Deep State and the Struggle Over Class and Caste in America. And it's really essential reading to understand where we are in this election because there's a simplistic theory. I mean, we have half the nation hates the other half and is afraid the other half or the other leader will destroy the nation. But there seems to be a consensus that everything was once great. Hillary Clinton said, Donald Trump's wrong. He's not going to make America great. America was always great. That goes back to the election where she lost to Trump. But nonetheless, that is kind of in the air. It's the internet. It's Donald Trump's particularly horrible person, etc. And otherwise, we had a country that was, basically a great, bold, wonderful democratic experiment, and suddenly it's gone awry. And your book, which is really a basically well documented, researched conversation, it's a different form of a book. It's two very bright observers of all this, but they prepared and they're having a discussion about essentially what was the American democratic experience all about, and why does it seem to be off the rails now? And I'm going to let them explain it. But take it back to the beginning, and I guess it's Charles Derber. I'll let you. You've written more books than your colleague here, so why don't you tell us what you wanted to accomplish or have accomplished with this book?
Okay, well, I'm glad you mentioned the election, Bob. And, the reason I think this book will interest readers is that correctly people understand this is one of the most consequential elections we've probably had certainly in my lifetime and probably in most of the lifetime of listeners. So as you said, um, people think of Trump as a sui generis, new personality, new political force in America. The forces driving the kind of politics that he represents is seen as very novel and very different. And the purpose of this book is to put all of this in for the ordinary reader. It's written in a way that it's a conversation. We wrote it deliberately to be very easy to read. So this is not a highly academic book, but
But
it
it's well
does.
documented,
Yeah,
and
we do
yeah,
document our arguments. That's true. And basically, as you said, Bob, the real thrust of the book is to show that contemporary issues about democracy, which are being treated as sort of, whether it's due to the internet or just due to the personality of Trump or whatever, they actually go way back to the very beginning of the country. So what the book does is sort of go through the whole history of the country and look how the kind of politics that is treated as novel and completely different. And there are novel aspects to it. But what we show in the book is that the kind of very authoritarian, what we call proto-fascist or neo-fascist politics that Trump represents, really emerged at the very beginning of the country, among the people who are seen as beacons and the sort of inspirers of democracy. And to be very specific, and I'll let Yale add stuff on this. Jefferson, of course, is seen as the great voice of democracy. But we show in the book, when you look at Jefferson's letters, what he studied, he was a great student of British history. And the thing that kind of inspired his idea about the Declaration of Independence and the foundation of the United States really came from the Magna Carta in Britain, which was a document in 1215 where the nobles basically rebelled against the king. But when they did that, they didn't create democracy in medieval Britain. They created a system where the nobility, mostly rich white men, had the ability to exercise much more power relative to the king. Now, I think any listener can almost immediately see that, well, who is Donald Trump? He's a rich white man. We think, at least he tells us he's very rich. and he has a lot of rich white friends, other nobility, so to speak. And in a way, the way I present the Trump phenomenon in the book today is that it's the latest form of the Magna Carta. Basically, Trump is seeking to, based on both his wealth and his class buddies, his rich, billionaire buddies like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and so forth in Silicon Valley. There's Trump is basically sort of the kind of authoritarianism that he represents was really embedded in the founding of the country. These guys who founded the country were not interested. They were not interested. Obviously, slaves were 3/5 of a person. Women couldn't vote or own property. Poor white men could not vote. It took many, many years, even for poor white males, to exercise any kind of franchise. These guys were basically following the British nobility, saying, we don't want a king totally ruling us, but we're not looking for democracy, despite Jefferson's flowery words on that. He was simply saying, we are going to set up a country where, in the name of democracy, we're going to be able to exercise our powers of class related to our economic fortunes and related to our skin color and our caste. We are going to be able to run a country that is thinking of and being presented to the world as a democracy, but is actually being run as the British nobility ran England for centuries after the Magna Carta, by a small elite of rich white men.
Wow.
That's, yeah,
So, and all the turmoil and aspirations and hopes, beginning with the Bill of Rights,
right.
were an effort of the disenfranchised by wealth or privilege, caste, or so forth, to exert some restraining force. Yale, is this
If
the
you
book
look
that
at the American definition of freedom, and I'm not sure this applies to any other country, freedom is freedom from the state. There is the private citizen. The private citizen is free to do anything he wants. The private citizen includes the corporation. Corporation is free to pay sub minimum wage, free to destroy the environment, uh, free to produce consumer goods that deteriorate, free to profit from wars. But this is done by private citizens who are not part of the state. If you look at the actual text of the Bill of Rights, the very first paragraph begins, Congress shall make no law. The Bill of American idea of freedom is restraint upon the state. The state is not supposed to interfere with the private citizen. Private citizen can do whatever he wants. And as Charles says, this has a direct lineage from the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was a restriction upon the king. The king could not interfere with the rights of nobility. The nobles were free to do as they wished to the peasant. The capitalist is free to do as he wishes to the worker, to the consumer. The slave owner is free to do as he wishes to the slave. The private citizen can do whatever he wants. That's freedom.
Let me
And
just add to this. The concept that Yale is talking about is negative freedom, the freedom to be left alone. It's coming back to the election. It's kind of the idea of freedom that Kamala Harris is offering. It's a free, she says, women, and appropriately so, should be free to exercise their reproductive rights independent of control from the state. And she's making her whole campaign rest on this very traditional American concept of freedom. And it's not unimportant. On the other hand, I think Yale was leading toward the idea that there is a different concept of freedom, which has never really been embodied in America, although in the New Deal, you began to see a little bits of it, which is positive freedom rather than negative. Rather than freedom from, it's freedom to. The freedom that is, you say, I have a right. We're talking about positive rights or negative rights. Kamala is saying she will ensure that your negative rights to be free from control, are going to be guaranteed by her. Trump is going to presumably not make that possible as a noble caste. He will interfere with that.
Well,
But
freedom,
but
freedom,
Kamala, let me just say,
yeah.
Kamala is ignoring the right for things, the right to eat, the right for health care, the right for education. Those are rights that were never embodied in the Constitution or in the concept of democracy in America. So I think the idea of rights that you mentioned, Bob, is an important thing for people to think about when they're thinking about the election, is the kind of freedom and rights that they want. Is it the right for certain things, or is it both? And I think Kamala is diminishing many important rights by focusing on negative rights, rights to be free from control that Yale was talking about, but not rights so much. I mean, she talks a little about childcare and that sort of thing, the right to have enough money and enough public services to raise a family. But she's pretty limited on that. In contrast to Trump, of course, she looks pretty good.
Harris, interestingly enough, is using Republican language. She is using the exact same ideology to defend the right to abortion as Republicans used to attack Obama's Affordable Care Act. Do you want government controlling your body? It is essentially the same question. Interestingly enough, the positive rights that Charlie's talking about, one of the best statements of them is the UN Declaration of Universal Rights, which, interestingly enough, was written by American First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. So it is not part of American tradition. It is not part of American legal theory, but it is something that emerged at least through the New Deal. It was articulated perhaps better than anybody else by Eleanor Roosevelt, and it became an official document of the United Nations, not part of American legal theory.
Yeah, and I want to go back, Bob, if I could, just very briefly to you. I want to ask you about the beginning of the country and Trump. And the thing I don't think either of us has made quite clear yet is that we argue in the book, people talk about Trump as a sort of a new embodiment of a kind of American fascism. And this book, which is looking at all of American history, argues that there was a kind of fascism that evolved in the United States from the very beginning. There are a lot of books coming out right now about fascism, and some about fascist tendencies in America. But in our book, we try to make very simple and clear the ways in which we call them fascist ghosts, and in the beginning of the country, proto-fascism, very early forms of fascism began. And that was most clear, as you said. We argue, the book does deal with the concept of the deep state. And we use the term with some overlap from Trump, but what we mean by a deep state is a group of unelected people, largely with wealth, and largely people who have the right skin color and the right gender. And whenever you have people who are not elected, who have enough control or influence over the people who are elected that they have a kind of dominant control, you have a deep state operating. Trump catches a bit of it. There's an overlap because he focuses on the CIA, the FBI, DOD, and other, pretty aggressive militaristic elements in the American, in the American state. But that's, in our view, only one. It's a very important, but one sector of the larger deep state, which, as America was born in the beginning in the North, the real deep state was sort of an embryonic, mercantile, capitalist deep state. It was run by merchants who had deep interest in the profits in the slave trade, and who both before the revolution and after the revolution were the dominant force in America. The Southern deep state, which came together with them, was more of what we call not a mercantile capitalist deep state, but a marriage between the capitalist North and the slave South that we see as clearly a proto-American fascist. It was based on, rule not simply by wealth, but by skin color and by, only white males, much like British nobility, were able to run America. So we think that the kind of idea that Trump represents a kind of American fascism. This book drills down into that concept and argues that when you look carefully at American history, you see a whole evolution of American fascism, which came at the very beginning of the country and went through evolutionary stages through the Civil War, resurfaced the marriage, this very difficult marriage between the North, Northern capitalism, the capitalist deep state, and the Southern proto-fascist deep state. It led to a divorce of that marriage in the Civil War. But after the Civil War, another kind of uneasy marriage developed in Jim Crow between the South and the West increasingly, which was still operating on caste power, and the federal Northern capitalist system, which came to be full-blown American capitalism.
The deep state is essentially unseen. It has perhaps the real power. Uh, Most people are vaguely aware of its existence. There is the official state, much of which is elected. It gets the attention of the media. It is what people focus on. It gets blamed for almost all troubles. And the deep state, rather the official state, allows the deep state to more or less rule and be unnoticed. It gives free rein to corporations, free rein to the very rich, and they can more or less do whatever they want with the official state carrying almost all the blame for what happens. And we hear Kamala Harris saying, do you want the official state ruling your life? Now, the problem is, and we can talk about, for example, healthcare. If the question were asked, do you want the government controlling your body? The answer would almost certainly be no for most people. But the problem is, the assumption is you are going to control your own body. But that is seldom the case. This is the case only for the very, very rich. For the vast majority, medical decisions are made by insurance companies whose primary concern is their own profit, not the well being of the patient. So the question is not, do you want to control your own body yourself? Because everybody does, but very, very few can. The question is, do you want that control to rest in the hands of a government that has some claim of accountability to you, or a corporation which is accountable only to itself?
So let me push back a little bit and defend Kamala Harris in the sense of a more complex figure, because it's quite right that, first of all, she was a prosecutor much of her career, and she basically was protecting the status quo from people challenging it, either out of becoming criminal or desperate or what have you. But uh, when she pushed back, and I want to raise this as a basic question because what's so refreshing about your book is it discusses class, and it would seem to me the pretense of the Democratic Party, leaving Kamala aside, and I'll bring her back. The pretense of the Democratic Party is they represent working people, they represent the class that's been denied, poor people and marginalized groups and so forth. Now we know, in the case of American history, the Democratic Party was until quite recently identified with slavery and through that segregation and so forth. But I'm just thinking something happened with Bill Clinton relating to class, which is why your book and its insistence on considering class is so important. Under Bill Clinton's leadership, it would have happened under Reagan, but he couldn't pull it off. We had heightened class differences in America. We've had growing income inequality. He was the one who deregulated the banks. He was the one that destroyed the New Deal regulation. That's well documented. And he visited and he celebrated the internets. They don't have to be under trust control. They can just at random buy up things and so forth. Kamala Harris, as the Attorney General of California, was one of the people, like Eliot Spitzer in New York, who did push back on that. Did say you have to hold Wall Street accountable, right? Uh, there was some of that. Whether she sticks to that is another issue. But there is certainly, at least in the Democratic Party, as opposed to the Republican Party, I'm just pushing back here. You have people like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren who actually have tried to push back on Wall Street's power to destroy, the on behalf of the white 1%, destroy the other 99%. So why don't we address that a little bit?
Before I say anything else, let me be clear. I will vote for Harris. Having said that, I'm appalled by some of the people who she has accepted as sponsors. She is embracing the Cheneys. You talk about fascism. Here's a place where Charlie and I probably disagree. I believe Richard Cheney was more of a fascist than Trump. Richard Cheney gave us the Patriot Act, which is very similar to Hitler's Enabling Act, giving a free range to obliterate all civil liberties, arrest people at random for no apparent reason, monitor people's conversations, uh, the books that they borrow. This is a gift from Dick Cheney. Luckily, it was never fully enforced. But these are people with whom Harris is actually trying to build alliances. Is Trump a fascist? You can call him that. But I don't believe he's any less of a fascist than, say, Cheney or even Reagan or Bush Jr.
So this is where, I mean, this is why we wrote this book in a conversational form. We wanted to make it as democratic. We've written a number of books together, and we kind of compromised our views on this. Like what Yale just said, I pretty strongly disagree with what he said. That is, I think that Kamala is reaching out to these conservative Republicans because she correctly realizes she's going to need a very wide spectrum of support, and that the left is sufficiently small, is pretty small, and to get a lot of the independent persuadables at this point is probably important to getting her elected. But I think that and Cheney, I when Yale and I talk about this, militarism is not the same as fascism. Very often, fascists turn focus on the enemy within, then which allows. They say if the enemy is within, like those Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, right now, who are eating their dogs and cats, according to Trump, that allows for stoking the anger and the fear that the people in a country. And about, I don't know if you saw this, 2 days ago, a poll showed that 54% of the country said they support mass deportation of immigrants. So that's a kind of very wide, broad, legacy of the neo-fascist tradition in America. And it means this election is going to be super close because the anti-immigrant, anti sort of racially driven lines about these black immigrants who are, polluting the country and basically destroying it has a long history, dating back to the founding of the country, slavery, to the recurrence of Jim Crow. The whole division of the country by race has, been going on in every stage of American history. So I think Trump's authoritarianism should be taken very seriously, and that every progressive person should be voting for Harris. At the same time, every progressive person should be recognizing that while she is clearly standing against caste power, her question about her relation to class power, how she's going to relate to the corporate powers that run this country right now, is very much in question. She's got the support of labor, but she's taking position on a lot of things that's going to require a lot of mobilization by the people who believe in Bernie Sanders and believe in even the progressive caucus in the House.
So
It's
let me defend. I'm going to I want to give more time to Professor Magrass, Yale Magrass, because I think it's a point we have to consider. How do people get to be reactionaries and racists and so forth? There's usually a source of discontent, of alienation, of failure, and we've had a lot of it's amazing. We talk about union support for Harris, but the fact is, we know certainly the white working class and maybe increasingly brown and black working people do not feel well served by the dominant political structure and the Democratic Party. I mean, the housing meltdown, which basically Bill Clinton was the author of it, the most effective groups were black and brown college graduates. Lost the most. They were targeted with these liars, loans, and so forth. And you have a situation. I'm going to toss it to Professor Magrass, but there's a real question of whether Democratic Party jingoism vis-a the world, contempt for the losers in America, which is probably two-thirds of the population, are been really hurt by their policies, uh, is the basis of the discontent that has supported Trump, including the betrayal by the Republican Party. And one could argue the refreshing thing about Trump is he actually is less interested in pursuing American imperial conquests around the world. And the Democrats are just wild for these wars. After all, Vietnam was a Democratic war. Second President Bush did advance it with Iraq, but the enthusiasm for American dominance, American exceptionalism, the revival of NATO, and even on civil liberties. It was Barack Obama who used the Espionage Act more than all previous presidents combined to oppress people, like Julian Assange and others. So take it, Yale. Give us
We are
what do
hearing
you guys disagree about? Yeah,
We
go
are
ahead.
hearing Trump is a threat to American national security, American interest. These are not things that are to be questioned. Trump held classified documents. He was president. Whether or not classified documents should exist is one question. But if anyone has a right to classified documents, it should be the president. Uh, Trump did not initiate the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan, although he did not end them. He is accused of wanting to undermine NATO. NATO is a militaristic alliance originally intended to constrain the Soviet Union, but still its central purpose is to constrain its residue, Russia. He wants some kind of withdrawal. The claim, and it's somewhat legitimate, is that Trump is actually a threat to the so-called deep state. He's a threat to national security. He's a threat to the military, a threat to the CIA. These things we ought to oppose. He is personally obnoxious, personally repulsive, but let's look at his vice president, J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance, before he was a politician, wrote a book called Hillbilly Elegy, where he was talking about the Appalachian white working class, its oppression, its grievances, its poverty. If you assume, and a lot of so called democratic, liberal, and even leftist rhetoric talks about white privilege, you ask the hillbillies, out of which Vance emerged, about their privileges, they're going to answer, what privileges? I am as poor as the vast majority of the black population. This emphasis, this caste formation, which we hear from Harris, we hear from Democrats, divides people who are naturally allies. There is a very serious question. What do white poor, what do the white working class have to get out of a movement that is essentially one of identity politics, where if you are black, you are oppressed. If you're female, you're oppressed. But if you are white, no matter how poor you are, you're not oppressed. Uh, there is legitimately a real concern for police harassment of people of color. There's no question that goes on. But Whites, I'll give myself an example, have certainly experienced police harassment. And I've been told I'm white. I cannot possibly know what police harassment is. I am basically being excluded from such movements. Rather than building alliances of all oppressed people, you divide them and turn them against each other.
Yeah,
And
yeah. Go ahead, yeah.
Trumpism is largely a reaction against that. A misguided reaction, to be sure. It completely ignores the real source of the issue, but it is based upon legitimate grievances that certain people feel excluded have.
I mean, the thing is that Yale mentions the hillbillies. Um, J.D. Vance did not end up, arguing the case despite the rhetoric in the Trump Vance ticket about, helping the white forgotten working man who was white, presumably, and living in the blue states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Um, Vance went to California, got employed as a venture capitalist by Peter Thiel, the billionaire of Silicon Valley, and who is an extreme right wing guy who is collecting a group of extremely rich billionaires who are promoting Trump's cause. So Trump is exploiting the abandonment of white working class people by a Democratic Party that has moved to focus on eradicating caste, but leaving class alone. And when they do that, as Yale just said, white, poor, and working class people, and that's a huge vote. The percentage of voters who are white, non-college people is 40%. That's a huge, voting block in the population. Most of them are not unionized because the Democratic Party has, since Clinton, largely abandoned helping workers organize. And so we're seeing a working class that is facing enormous job insecurity, AI and all kinds of outsourcing and technological displacement, which makes their situation extremely vulnerable. And then they're looking at two political parties where you have a Trumpist party, which is saying we're representing the forgotten man, but is really actually promoting the corporate interests of the billionaires of the country. Then if they look at the Democrats and Kamala Harris, do they see a party that's speaking up for the working classes, the white working classes, as well as the black and brown working classes? And the answer to that question will shape the outcome of the election, because Kamala Harris is getting union support and is working hard to try to get it. Even the Teamsters, just today broke. The national Teamsters refused to support Harris, but local Teamster unions in California and New York did support Harris. But the Democratic Party that has abandoned class issues, which really happened as the New Deal fell apart. And we traced the history of this. How was it possible that the working class, which became both, particularly the white working class, so central to the building of the Democratic Party in the 30s and through the 60s, got fully abandoned by the Democratic Party after Reagan and with Clinton and Obama even, because the class power issues, remember, this country has always been organized by two competing forms of power that intersect often, class and caste. The Democratic Party in the 30s with the New Deal was heavily focused on class. So it won over the working class. Today, since Clinton, I think as you were intimating, Bob, the Democratic Party is focusing very heavily on caste, what we call identity politics, and has sort of moved away from the Bernie Sanders focus on class. Biden moved away a bit from Clinton and even from Obama and pushed labor and class issues a bit more. Kamala seems to be pulling a little bit back from that. And I think the future of both her election and what happens afterward is going to depend on whether labor and, cross race and gender coalitions can help move caste politics toward anti-class politics. And that's going to be determining, because it's going to be a few thousand blue collar voters in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania that are going to determine who wins. And if they come to see Kamala as basically selling out to, and if they feel abandoned by the Democratic Party, and they're simply favoring, poor people of race, people of color, and women, those are critical constituencies and to deserve every bit of organization politically we can get. But they can only really gain power when they're aligned with working class people who are white, which are a huge percentage of the population. And whether Kamala will actually, engineer and help build that kind of coalition is going to shape the future of the world.
So let me, because we don't have unlimited time here, but I think we're at a really interesting question here. And for a lot of people listening to this, it's going to be odd language. What is this caste? What is class? And so forth. But I want to cut to the chase on that because there's anger in America, and my own view of it very clearly, it's about ignoring class, and that's what Occupy was about. But that got snuffed out primarily by Democratic mayors who called the cops and broke up these demonstrations and so forth. And I don't think that we can understand the unhappiness, the anger in America, if we don't understand that most people, male and female, black, brown, white, and everything, most people feel cut out. However, that does not include influential influencers in the media who are a kind of courtier class. I want to introduce that notion. Let me be a little bit C. Wright Mills here. And there's a courtier class, including guys like you, maybe myself, who have university positions, get security, have at least the illusion of some influence, are more successful compatriots in this academic and influencer world, even get jobs in administrations. They get to be lawyers for banks, they get to be PR people. So there's a class of people who basically have sold out and who then shape messages. And they shape a message that America is working. And you're getting that more from the Democrats now than from the Republicans. And it seems to me the argument in this election is really over the assertion the Democrats are saying it's basically been working, and now these bad Republicans and Trump are messing it all up and are going to throw us back into evil times. There's a whole other larger group in America, if you include undecided and so forth, and maybe they'll even go for Harris, but they're saying, it's not really working. I even go to the subway to get a sandwich, and it's now costing me 40, $50 for a couple of sandwiches and chips for the kids and everything. This inflation has been terrible. The good jobs are not coming back. And ironically, it was under Trump during the pandemic that we suddenly, tripled unemployment benefits, that we suddenly were throwing money at the problem of, poorer people and working people and doing what really was sort of a New Deal kind of stuff. So I'd like you to address that because we've let and maybe I was too kind to Kamala Harris here. We've left the Democrats off the hook. In fact, because they have not shown the positive government for people. Healthcare has really not dramatically improved, certainly not on the cost of healthcare. Let's take the remaining time to talk about, how did we get to this place? We're in trouble now. What is the responsibility of both parties? We know about Trump. What about the Democrats?
I quote Obama's very first words as president elect. Is there anyone now who can question that in America all things are possible? Look at me. Look at my skin color. I am black, but I'm about to live in the White House. I have achieved the American dream. The American dream is real. Anyone can achieve it. If you don't achieve it, you ain't got nobody to blame but yourself. Oprah lives now in a $200 million palace. Fine. Before the civil rights movement, she would not, billionaire or not, she would not be allowed to buy it. To buy it. But how does Oprah's ability to buy a $200 million mansion enhance the lives of the people from the Chicago ghetto where she came? And the emphasis on race, emphasis on caste, completely neglects the real causes of misery, the real causes of poverty, which both people of all colors experience. Oprah is clearly of a very different class than the welfare mothers among whom she grew up. How does she represent their interests? How does she represent them? What in fact she says is, look, I succeeded. I made it. Why can't you? There's something wrong with you. The problem rests with you. Charlie talked about Vance. Vance is a very good example. Vance went to Yale and then became involved in Silicon Valley, became involved with millionaires, became completely isolated from the hillbillies out of which he emerged. Incidentally, we had a hillbilly president, and his name was Bill Clinton. But the hillbillies are clearly not being given anything by the Democratic Party. Poor whites have good questions to ask. What is in it for me? What are poor blacks really getting? Or if the so-called glass ceiling is broken, what are welfare mothers going to get? This emphasis on caste doesn't look at who is affected by what and how. It's
And
and
we trace this in the book, Bob. When you say we're making class and caste abstract ideas, I mean, I think Yale has just put very clearly a big discussion we have in the book about what it means for a Democratic Party, which used to focus on the bad wages that led to people, getting massively unemployed in the Depression, people not being able to, make a living. That was a period of American history where the Democratic Party paid attention to people's wages, to people's economic opportunities, and to the whole issue of economic class, money and its power in America. That period in American history is really quite unique because we look before and afterwards, and we see that it's very unusual for any of the, we have two parties of business, unlike in Europe where you have labor parties, which have been able to express the class interest, the economic interest of people who, as you rightly said, Bob, and is a big theme of my book, are being abandoned by both parties. There is no party that, for other than in the era of the New Deal, who ever represented working class people of both races, people who are poor, people who are struggling to make it. And that's, about 65% of Americans say they are working paycheck to paycheck. Are those people seeing in the Democratic Party a voice that's really going to help them get by? Well, Trump says he's going to represent them, and they believe him because they've lost faith in the Democratic Party, which they see as simply representing the interests of people of color and women, as just not relevant to their problems. Trump seems to be talking to them. The reality is we do know, and I disagree, Bob, with what you said about, significant social welfare going to, poor workers during the first Trump era. I mean, his overwhelming redistribution of wealth was in his tax breaks for the very rich corporate elite, which was the main thing Trump did in his first term was enrich his very rich white friends. Now, the question is, why did the New Deal and the Democratic Party abandon the working class? Why did they turn fully to dealing simply with, issues of race and gender and forget how significant, in just the ways Yale very well described, if you forget about class, focusing on race and gender is going to lead to very little change even for women and black people. I don't minimize it. It's not nothing, but the ability of Kamala Harris to really mobilize an agenda that is truly going to help, black workers and women who are working class is going to depend on a really big change in the Democratic Party that Biden made a first few steps in direction of, which is to go back to the New Deal model and say we need a green, much more dramatic New Deal, which is a Democratic Party politics that is not focused on identity issues of race and gender, but says race and gender are part of a complex of, the division of this society into a majority of people, white, black, and brown, who have no chance.
Yeah, and okay, so we only at most we have 7 minutes or so. I'm not going to let this go over an hour. And let me just cut to the chase here. Your book, I don't think we've given your book enough credit here, because you're arguing something very disturbing, very disturbing. You're basically arguing the game is rigged, and what you call shallow democracy is really a hustle. That it really does not portend significant change. That basically it's become, and always was really, a con job of mass freedom, mass participation. But the game was rigged long before the internet, long before Donald Trump. And the title, The Real Deep State and the Struggle Over Class and Caste in America. And I read your book. It's a very interesting book. It's mercifully, as I say, it's only about 250 pages. But
250.
huh?
250.
That's what I said.
Oh, I thought you
250.
said 450. Yeah.
And but what it suggests, and this is what we mean by the deep state, and you don't deny the CIA and the FBI and all that, but really what you're arguing is that people of wealth and privilege, the caste thing, but basically of wealth, control the system. And that the politicians, both parties, the people we're going to vote for, are really dangling off a puppeteer's string, and that we shouldn't kid ourselves about this. And that's what really Clinton came from a poor background. Clinton knew the poverty of hillbillies and others, poor Southern whites and everything. He betrayed them with great enthusiasm. He betrayed
Right,
them,
right.
and actually, at some point, Democrats are going to have to admit that Bill Clinton did what Ronald Reagan couldn't pull off. The fact of the matter is, Ronald Reagan did not do as much damage to the ideas of some kind of equality of opportunity, let alone results, that Bill Clinton did. Bill Clinton is the one who unleashed Wall Street greed. And Ronald Reagan actually was forced to contain it a little bit with the savings alone. So what's at play now, and what your book, and we haven't really addressed that. I'll let you guys have the last 6 minutes here, but really, it's a pretty depressing situation. It's not going to get better anywhere time soon, even though the Democrats have a vice president who seems to care about working people and so forth. Because the people who control the media, who control the action, who control the dialogue, who control the narrative, don't want it to get better. They want their privilege, they want their greed, and they really don't care about the great mass of people, except to keep them amused or disoriented or something. Isn't that the radical message of your book?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it argues, yes, that has been the power, but this book is not only shows the power of class and caste to, run exactly what you said, Bob, a government that really neglects the great majority of the population and suppresses them. But the book also traces that a real, and this is a little bit like Howard Zinn for listeners who know a people's history of the United States. The book goes deeply into not only the history of proto-fascism and all the right-wing and corporate movements in America, it looks at a long legacy of progressive, populist, left populist, socialist, labor movements that have had great success in raising consciousness, creating incremental, it never created revolution in America. It never even created European social democracy, which was bought by European social democrats and labor parties. But the book is, you portray it as like a puppeteer book, arguing that the American people are simply being strung along. And there is real truth to that. But the book also has a very strong message that the history of the country shows that ordinary people have constantly resurfaced, whether they're farmers in the 1890s in the face of, extreme economic, control by the early forms of Wall Street, through the New Deal, through the Great Society, through all the way up to Occupy Wall Street that you mentioned, and now to the Bernie Sanders Democratic Socialist sort of cause. There's a lot of people. I think, the hope, if we can really get the kind of message out there, there's a real hunger. The polls show that about 80% of the population hates the rich people who are running this country. They want a Democratic Party that is really going to stand up to the billionaires and to the people who have long had control in the country. And the book looks at the legacy of those movements, much as Howard Zinn tried to do in A People's History. And it shows that is real. I mean, it's always resurfaced in American history. And I think I think Biden himself, for all his militarism and, his relative centrism, brought back, he walked in a picket line. He did a lot of public investment in jobs and in healthcare and in climate and Green New Deal. So the book is not at all hopeless, nor
Yeah,
does it
but
portray
the
the
income gap and the immiseration of the mass of people is worse than it's been.
at the moment.
Yeah, and by the way, if you think about Occupy and everything, it was Barack Obama who had an opportunity to actually do something about Wall Street after the great breakdown of the housing meltdown, and nothing was done. And in fact, what they did under the people that Clinton had brought in, the Wall Street people, Robert Rubin and Geithner and Lawrence Summers, and all of
Right.
these people, they rewarded the people that destroyed the economy and the well-being of people, and they made them whole. They made AIG whole. They made Citigroup whole.
Let me give the counterpoint, because the book is really, this conversation between me and Yale is reflective of what goes on in the book. Yale being much more pessimistic that any possibility of real change is possible. Let me go back to the beginning very briefly. The thing that was distinctive about the American Revolution, which was definitely not a revolution for democracy, but it did get cloaked in an ideology of a veneer, so to speak, of both civil liberties and of sort of aspirations, the democratic aspirations that became part of the American cultural story. Now, that's not insignificant. So, because that kind of ideology, while it was never corresponding to the realities of American society, was deeply bred into students when they grew up. They read the Declaration of Independence, and the shallow democracy that we talk about, that you referred to, Bob. The shallow democracy means that the capitalists realize they can't rule with any legitimacy if they shut down elections altogether and eliminate civil liberties altogether. So the civil liberties that always, existed and grew as an ideal in America and a reality, they still exist today. We're having this conversation without being shot. If we couldn't have this conversation, I would be sharing Yale's pessimism. The fact that thousands of people can have conversations like this, and not at this stage, Trump might change that, not be shut down and shot or buried or imprisoned, offers the possibility of change. And there are millions of young people, I'm in touch with a lot of these people every day, who are having these conversations. I have them in classrooms, even with young people who are planning to go into Wall Street and are sort of being socialized into the corporate ethos, who have deep ethical and social concerns. They believe that they will change the way Wall Street and private equity operate. Those cultural ideals are a countervailing power that's real in America. The civil liberties that is a foundation of capitalist rule. If the capitalists take away civil liberties the way Trump wants to, capitalism will collapse. It rests on, because civil liberties, the freedom for us to have this conversation, or for us to write this book without it being banned or without us being jailed for having this conversation, is very meaningful. And there have been a whole sequence of movements, socialist movements. One of Yale's heroes is Eugene Debs. He went to jail, but he got over 1 million votes for president when he ran in, during World War I against Wilson. So I just think that when you look at the history, what you see is that this enormous power has not created hopelessness in America, and that these movements and the civil liberties and the ideals that people have taken seriously, despite their hypocrisy, have made a real difference historically. If these movements can develop under much more constrained, more repressive circumstances, you know, under slavery. If you look at abolitionism, or if you under the Jim Crow with the Ku Klux Klan, when the populace began calling for public control of Wall Street, we look at American history, I see a lot of movements that had no chance of change where people rose up. They really expressed their ideals in ways that had meaning, and they made some change. So I think if anybody reading this book would see two things. One, they would see the enormous power that has always controlled the country to a very large degree. At the same time, they would see that this power had to contend, in order to sustain itself, had to contend with political conditions and ideological and cultural ideas that always kept a seedbed of change, both class change and caste change, alive. And I think that is never gone. And I think, again, if you read Howard Zinn's book, you see very, very clear evidence of how these progressive, radical movement changes are, read Noam Chomsky. Chomsky sees these power. We're very good friends with Chomsky, um, and written stuff with Chomsky. And, Chomsky sees it very much the same way. There's nobody who sees the world as more controlled by the military, the CIA, and the corporate class than Noam Chomsky, who, by the way, for people listening who care about it, is, I think, doing better with his health right now. Hopefully will come fully back. But a Chomsky who believes in the enormous power of, the deep corporate state is also a person who believes deeply. He spent his whole life, starting with Dan Ellsberg and Howard Zinn in affinity groups, during Vietnam, as you know well, Bob, and spent his whole life, engaging in change activity outside the Democratic Party, inside the Democratic Party. So I think that the fact that you have a very radical analysis of power does not lead you to give up hope. And again, I would.
Obviously, look, let's cut to the chase here. We're three old codgers, and what we have is some historical knowledge, and we've been there, we've been around, and so forth. And, now we're getting to the cheerleading part. Obviously, we don't want to bum everybody out. Obviously, you keep fighting for justice. That's why we're still doing this. We're not making big bucks doing this or something.
Right.
And we're doing that of some obligation and some optimism and so forth. But I don't want to deceive people. I think the situation is pretty damn desperate. And, my hat's off to all the people you mentioned. But the fact of the matter is, we're not being killed, but a lot of people are being killed around the world
That's for sure.
by a government that speaks in our name, that we effectively empower. By we vote for one side or another. It's not helping people being killed in Gaza. It's not helping people being killed in the fighting in the Ukraine or with Russia, that we have played a mischievous role. So is Putin. I mean, I'm not defending any other government in the world. What I'm saying is, ordinary people are getting screwed everywhere, getting killed everywhere, and
Absolutely.
they're also being sacrificed economically. Our prosperity during this whole period depended upon exploiting workers in China. Now they want to shift it to India or Vietnam or what have you. We're raping the world of resources. We're destroying the future of life on the planet. And we are we're the in the belly of the beast here.
Yeah,
And
but Bob,
yes,
why are you running?
I want to challenge you a little bit here. I'm willing to go longer if you hang in with me. I want to talk about whether we are not, in fact, part of the courtier class. People, the academic world, and now they're even challenging the limited freedom there. People are being fired, being people pushed out. But the fact that, I would point out under Obama, he used the national security state to throw people in jail and to punish people and so forth. and so did Biden. Kept Julian Assange in jail. Wasn't even an American, and so forth. I noticed Edward Snowden, is trapped where he is. Nobody ever thanked him for telling the truth. And I want to get at something that is the illusion. And this gets to the old argument between Huxley and Orwell. What form of totalitarianism are you talking about? And it seems to me, if we shift away from the boot, yeah, we have less of that. But if you think about our ability to get people to accommodate what they shouldn't, and to go along with what they shouldn't, and to not raise basic issues when other people are being killed or exploited all over the world, we're pretty damn good at it, right? We're pretty damn good at it. And yet they let us have these conversations. They let us write our books. So what? It doesn't affect anything,
So,
does
Bob,
it?
why do you run this conversation?
Because I don't know, my bones tell me I have to.
Yeah. So
But
listen to
but
your
but
bones.
I may be wrong. By the way, I read your book, and I liked the dialogue. I liked the tension between you two. I believe you have to debate these things, obviously, but I also don't want to deceive people.
We can talk
I
about
think things are pretty bad right now. That's what I'm saying.
Oh, we
Uh,
don't disagree.
we
We
can
well,
talk
don't
let's
about
spin to yeah. Go ahead.
what French Marxists called the ideological and the repressive apparatus. The repressive apparatus is the military, the police, the CIA, the Billy Club, blatant brutality. In America, as American citizens, we see relatively little of it. Perhaps if you don't have the right skin color, you see much more. Be that as it may. You go to banana republics, places in the third world, you see a direct brutality you don't see in America. Why? The United States, as you pointed out, has by far the world's largest repressive apparatus. Its military nine is larger than the other nine next most militarized countries combined. We know nothing can threaten it. It is secure. Because it is secure, it doesn't have to worry about being overthrown. It can allow us to say anything we want because it doesn't matter. It can be, at best, entertainment. It can keep a few people amused, people quiet. People can say, I have free speech. What a wonderful country this is. It allows me to say these outrageous things because it knows what we say doesn't matter. If, in fact, it did matter, we would see a level of brutality that would vastly exceed anything going on in any third world dictatorship.
Well, you're
There,
seeing on campuses where students are this spring, on campuses all over the country, they were brutally repressed.
yes, we're
Why?
saying that. We're
Because
saying
they were
what
afraid.
is threatened is taken away. You can say anything you want as long as what you say doesn't matter. If it matters, you do face the club. You face.
Okay, so we're facing really bad times. We all agree with that. Um, but at the same time, I think it's dishonest and not true to Bob when you say, "Well, I'm just doing this because I feel it in my bones, but I don't really believe that anything is really possible to change." Let me give you one sort of very basic.
Let me excuse
Just,
me.
let me just finish.
Let
No,
me stop for a second. I just want to say
okay.
that's not what I'm really saying. What I'm saying is, and this is something maybe we could agree on or at least examine, all three of us and Chomsky and everyone. I interviewed Chomsky about this whole thing. We all, at the end, fall for the lesser evil argument. We all get sucked into the system of, okay, they're better than the others. Your book, and I think we haven't given this book enough credit. The conversation in this book says that's a trap. That's what the conversation, that's what I got out of your book. That in fact, and I'm one of those people that is used to champion Jefferson. I thought the Declaration of Independence was great, and I remember Norman Lear bought one of the original manifestos. We had it in my class, the actual thing. One of my students read and came up to me and said, "Hey, professor, do you know how they talk about indigenous people here?" in the Declaration of Independence, right? As merciless savages,
Right.
right? And that it was for genocide against those people was acceptable. Okay, and so what I'm saying is the radicalism. I will say the radicalism of your conversation, that is this book, is pretty damn depressing, but I think it's also accurate. Uh, and that in fact, you know, it may be the crowd we are championing as the lesser evil might have a greater capacity for selling evil. After all, it was the Democrats under Lyndon Johnson that did what Martin Luther King condemned as when he said, "My government is the major purveyor of violence in the world today." He wasn't attacking Richard Nixon. He died before Richard Nixon. He was attacking Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah, you make a really good point, and there's no question that the Democratic Party, post Clinton, post Reagan, is selling, the evil in the name of black and gender liberation, and it's extremely depressing, and it's extremely violent, and extremely upsetting.
The
On
reason
the other hand,
they
let me
worry
just
about
let me
Trump.
finish. On the other hand, the where I derive some hope in the current moment, as well as from the historical record, is that if you ask people, Americans, what do you think of rich people? About 90% say they think that rich people and corporations are destroying the country. On a whole set of, if you ask them, how do you feel about capitalism? Just emotionally, do you have a positive reaction to capitalism or to socialism? About 60% of young people today say they have a negative reaction to the word capitalism and a positive association to the word socialism. On a whole bunch of very fundamental issues, a super majorities of Americans say like, we'd love to be in a kind of social democracy with real positive rights and real positive freedoms. The reason we don't have that and we're such a bad thing is that the Democratic Party, we have a duopoly. My friend Ralph Nader was constantly, crusading against this, but we do have two parties and they're both corporate parties. So all of this genuine, horror on the ground about the power of rich people to, destroy the world, destroy other countries in the name of making more money, that's well understood by 80% of the American population. That at least suggests that, this is not the lesser evil. It suggests that there's a way to speak to a very large number of Americans and speak to what they already really believe. And how come they believe it, Bob? Why do 80% of the people say American capitalism is destroying much of our lives? I mean, how is it possible that so many people are saying that?
The
Because
grievance that
because we integrated the ideology of that from the very beginning that this neo-fascist Jefferson wrote, which is that all people are equal and that there should be equal opportunity and freedom for all. Those ideas have power, despite the enormous.
Did you just call Jefferson a neo-fascist?
Well, I spent the whole earlier time talking about that. Yeah, I remember
Oh.
the Magna Carta. That's American fascism.
one of the largest slave owners
Yeah, Washington, Jefferson.
was the largest slave owner.
And Jefferson, years after the Declaration of Independence, wrote in the 1820s, Jefferson wrote he could not imagine blacks and whites living together. They were such different kinds of people that they could never live in a democracy or some sort of common society. Jefferson never, and the same was true of all the founding fathers.
The reason so much of the elite hates Trump is that he's too blatant. He's exposing myths that people are supposed to believe, and he's showing that they're not true. Example: everyone knows United States invades the middle Iraq and Afghanistan for oil, but that's not something you're supposed to say. You're supposed to say United States did it to grant them freedom. Trump spoke openly about oil. Trump spoke openly about the power of the deep state. Trump spoke openly about attacks on democracy. These are myths that are supposed to be suppressed. He was too open, too blatant, too in his rhetoric, and threaten people might discover the real truth. That's why they're so afraid of him.
But I want to go back. We're ending this on whether there's any genuine possibility of hope, and what are people who are listening to this going to take away? Do they really believe there's any hope? And there's two contradictory ideas I think that comes out of this conversation we've had, and also out of our book. One, that the systems of power have always been overwhelming and anti-democratic power, ruled by tiny elites, mostly of white rich people, has always been a massive, massive force in America. That's point number one. But Marx, if you're a leftist, always believed that history is driven by contradiction. So you can believe point one, that America has, all through its history, has been run by a cabal of rich white people. And at the same time, believe that the kinds of conditions, culturally, socially, and politically, that were necessary to sustain this overwhelming power created contradictory forces in the population. Part of them were cultural, part of them were beliefs, part of them were forms of that possibilities of organizing, which came with the limited civil liberties that the rich billionaires gave from the very beginning, that create a contradictory force. If people are confused, it's because it is very contradictory. We're living in a country with as much concentrated power as probably ever happened in history, most violence ever in the world. At the same time, we're living in a country where 80% of the population in that country are saying there's something horribly wrong with that. We don't like these billionaires. We think they're destroying our country. That opens a contradictory possibility of hope. But the best thing about Marx was he said history was the engine and the unraveling of latent systemic contradictions. And I think this whole, set of sort of debates and confusion that we're having as we talk about this is a reflection of the fact how deep those underlying contradictions are. And if you try to say, oh, it's all power, there's no hope, you're ignoring Marx's most fundamental idea, which was that power always generates contradictory forces that make possible, changes that are deep and structural. That doesn't mean you paper over how bad things are. Bad things are really, really bad right now. We could end. We haven't even talked about climate change in this conversation. The world could be over, extinct. I just wrote a book called "Dying for Capitalism," which is about how we've reached the point of extinction and what is the politics, going to look like in an era of extinction. So I don't minimize. I'm the more hopeful voice here, and I don't minimize the dangers here at all. I just think that the more you look at the dangers, the more you're obligated, and I think Marx would be the first to say this, to look at the contradictory forces that are still possible before we go extinct. We could easily go extinct, not just democracy, but the whole human, race.
Yeah.
But to say that is not to say that we should just fold up and go home, because
No one's saying that. We could be here for hours and still not conclude
well,
that.
that's why I say you see some of these contradictions yourself, Bob.
Yeah, and by the way, it's not just Marx. I mean, even maybe a more profound thinker, Leonard Cohen, who wrote such great music and lyrics, he said
Right,
there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets through.
right,
And I applaud. Look, I applaud your energy, and look, come on, you guys wrote. What did I say before? 28 books and nine. What does it make? 37 books
right.
between you.
Yeah.
No, 37. You're fighting the good fight. I want people to read the book. Let me just restate it. It's Who Owns Democracy? The Real Deep State and the Struggle Over Class and Caste in America. And the title really suggests what is really important about this. There's a reason why we don't talk about class and caste in America, because the illusion of this egalitarian society is the main cover up of how the system works. So let's leave it at that note. Want to thank you guys for doing this. I think it's
Thanks
an
for
hour
having
and a
us.
half well spent. And so let me just thank the people who helped put this on. Christopher Ho and Laura Kondarajian at KCRW, the terrific NPR station in Santa Monica, for posting these shows, podcasts. Joshua Scheer, our executive producer, who got me to do this week. Diego Ramos, who writes the introduction, Max Jones, who does the video, the JKW Foundation in memory of a very independent writer, Gene Stein, and Integrity Media, which really believes in an alternative media, questioning power, and provides some support for the show. See you next week with another edition of Scheer Intelligence.